So tonight's presentation is Speaking Up for Canadian English, which is all about ECE3, the third edition of Editing Canadian English. What, did I get that wrong?
No, I'm trying to remember where I put my notebook.
Oh. There's one here.
That's mine.
Okay.
I remember where it was. To those of you who don't know me, this is just how I am.
The online version launched in late February, and there's a print version that's going to be released in June in time for the conference. So tonight we have 4 editors who worked on the new edition to be speaking about their sections as well as giving us an overview of it. The presentation is being led by Nancy Foran, who is very kindly filling in for Krisha Lear, who was going to be here tonight but is unable to due to a health concern. Nancy Foran is a former member of the Toronto Branch Executive and co-chaired last year's conference committee. She's been editing for more than a decade and specializes in localization and editing French to English translations. She's the general editor of a new series of multilingual visual dictionaries to be published in fall 2015 and contributed to the Canadianization chapter in the latest edition of Editing Canadian English. And I'll leave it to Nancy to introduce the other 3.
Hello. Okay, I don't usually use mics, but I'm going to try tonight. So with me tonight, I have Elizabeth Danjou, who is a longtime member of EAC, actually a second-generation member of EAC, as most of us know. She is a former chair of the Toronto branch and a current member of the Kingston Twig. She's been teaching for over 15 years and has taught the principles of Canadian spelling to over 1,000 people in person, and I'm guessing more online. Is that, because in her bio that she sent me, she said that many in person. I'm like, and probably almost as many online. And this is partly, I'm sure, why she contributed to the spelling chapter of ECE. She is also has 20 plus years editing as a freelancer for all kinds of clients that I'm afraid I didn't have time to write down. And this is awesome. I love this. She said she charmed her now husband by comparing how editors like her use dictionaries to how woodworkers like him use saws. Which is like the best pickup line ever.
Been married 7 years.
And next to Elizabeth, we have Emily Dockrill Jones, who is also a former Toronto branch exec member and a KWG Twig coordinator. She co-chaired the conference committee with me last year and is also a former national PD coordinator. And if memory serves, you did 3 of those roles at the same time last year, right, Emily?
Yes, and had a baby.
And had a baby. And had a baby. So she knows multitasking.
So she's psychotic.
She started her company Page and Screen in 2010, and she works mainly in corporate and organizational communications in print and web, mostly in web, which is no doubt why she contributed the web editing chapter to ECE. And next to Emily, we have Gillian Watts, who started as an architecture training and then took degrees in history and museum studies, becoming a museum conservator and advisor. She then switched to freelance editing in the late 90s, and she took the Ryerson certificate in publishing and did as many EAC seminars as she could, she said. She's been an EAC member for almost 20 years and is also a longtime member of the Indexing Society of Canada. She's served on the exec of both organizations, and she is a really good indexer, which is why she contributed to the indexing chapter of ECE. And I also owe Gillian a big debt, because she's one of the copy editors I worked with when I first got into publishing, so thank you, Gillian. All right, so I am going to be presenting tonight. It's a PowerPoint that Krisha actually did. I'm really just here hitting buttons and saying her words. If you have questions, if you could hold them until the end, because all 4 of us have our little part, and I think if we start with questions, somebody might not have time for their part, and everybody's here, so I want everybody to have their time. So I'm going to move over here, and I'm going to start pressing buttons, and I'm going to talk loud enough for everybody to hear, hopefully without the mic. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. I have a voice that carries. It's usually not a problem. It's usually a problem to get me to be quiet, not loud. So we have Editing Canadian English, the 3rd edition. So we're looking at what's new in the new edition. So let's start in. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong side. And this is what's going to happen. There we go. Okay. So hold on. Okay, so how did we get from a print edition to this, which is the online edition? So we're going to start by asking a few questions. To those of you who don't know, I'm thinking we mostly have members here, you're aware that Editing Canadian English is now online, correct? This is not news to anybody? Okay, good. I probably should have prefaced it by saying, hey, Editing Canadian English is online if you don't know, but now you do. So we did have a book for a long time. It was getting out of date, so we're not only doing it in print, we are doing a new online. So we're looking at the who, what, where, why, when, and how of how we got to print to this. So let's look at who. It was 99 volunteers in total from EAC and beyond, 36 contributors, 10 from around Toronto, Creation was like, 4 national office staff, and our editor-in-chief was Karen Vareg, who passed away. Karen was an active member of ECE. She was from Edmonton. She helped shape ECE3 and shared much wisdom and practical advice. She was a brilliant editor and a wonderful colleague and friend to many EAC members, and ECE3 is dedicated to her and in her memory. Oh shoot, people, I hit the wrong thing. Sorry. Oh, there we go, I got it. I'm getting it. Okay. Okay, yeah, we did the who, now we're doing the what. So what is it? It's the newest guide to Canadian style. It has the latest info on all kinds of language and style issues, obviously, that pertain to Canadian English. If you've ever put a copy of ECE next to a copy of Chicago Manual Style, you will notice it's way smaller. It's very specific, and it's meant to supplement those other style guides we use. As a Canadian editor, particularly when it came out, there wasn't a whole lot of references out there. We cobbled dictionaries, and I still use mostly Chicago Manual Style, which I think most of us in trade publishing do. This is a sort of add-on to help specify those things that Canadian editors need to know. The online version has over 650 web pages. That's a lot of clear and reliable information. Sorry, I'm impressed. That's a lot of web pages. I'm hitting the wrong side again. Yep. There we go. So where? So ECE is now anywhere you have internet access. So that's, in this day and age, pretty much anywhere. Is there a phone? Does anybody know? Is there an app? Is there a phone? Can you look at it on your phone? I'm looking at you, Emily, because you're the web person. You don't know.
Is there an app for?
Can you look at ECE on your phone?
I have not tried, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
I have the web on my, like,
Yeah,
I can just
you
go to
have
the
it, yeah.
site, so I don't think there's an app, but
yeah,
certainly
but
I
you
have.
would be, if you could look at it on.
Yeah, my phone
That's
has
kind of crazy.
internet, so I can.
So there you go.
Yeah,
Alrighty.
so special, I can get on there.
So why? Because the second edition is 15 years old, or was 15 years old, so obviously a lot has changed. There wasn't a web editing chapter in that second edition. And because editors are language and style experts, who better to create a Canadian style guide than us? When work started 3 years ago, building on the 2 previous editions, and the online version was launched on February 25th. Members were offered a sneak peek preview in mid-January, and on the first day, someone emailed to say there was a typo on the first page, and they fixed it within minutes. I just look at that, I still think it's funny. Only EAC. So how did they go from a book to the 3rd edition online? So we're looking at 9 steps. And it's apparently the 9 steps are in my Word doc. So the planning stage was step 1, and that was Elizabeth McPhee, Anne Louise Mahoney, Carolyn Pisani, and Karen Vareg, the editor-in-chief, served as the core team during the initial planning stages of the project, which was started in 2011. Heather Ebbs later provided guidance and practical help at a key moment. The next step was a global review of the ECE2. As 5 senior editors did a global review of the 2nd edition and offered astute and helpful feedback that shaped the revised edition. This 3rd step was in-depth reviews of the individual chapters of ECE2. So 23 editors prepared in-depth reviews and critiques of each chapter of the 2nd edition, suggesting topics to be added or deleted, and providing guidance on how best to update the material. I was actually able to participate at that 3rd stage for the Canadianization chapter, and I think it was a very good step to take, to not jump straight from that big review into the writing. It gave, even if you weren't writing the chapter, it gave a real insight, and I think it added a lot to the quality of the book. The next stage was step 4, the creation of the categories and subcategories for the new edition. That's 32 editors devised categories and subcategories, which is what was given to the writers. The 5th step was the writing stage. 36 editors adapted existing text and wrote new text, finding time in between other projects and demands, including me and Emily, who did it in between conference planning. And this was a huge investment of time and energy from them, not to mention the pressure of writing about editorial matters for editors. And I can attest that that was really hard to write about editing for other editors. I had many moments of like, I can't do this. Step 6 was offering of input and raising key questions into particular sections. 31 editors provided input into particular sections, raising key issues and questions and enriching the text greatly. Step 7 was exploring of online databases to find out what worked well. 6 editors explored various online style databases and provided feedback on worked well and what didn't. Step 8 was uploading the files into the content management system. So 5 editors uploaded the Word files into the content management system with guidance from the web development team. And then step 9 was proofreading. 3 editors proofread the online text with care and expertise. And that must have been a huge shock for 3 editors. So, those were the 9 steps. Ooh, I keep hitting on the wrong side. I'm sorry. There we go. So that was the, oh, now we looked at them. It was on the sheet, but there. So now we're going to run through the slides quickly. I've said it, step 9, proofreading. All right, so your go-to guide. So now that you know where it came from, let's take a closer look at what's actually in Editing Canadian English 3. So it's a style guide, a reference manual, a judgment call, coach, and more. It's an indispensable tool for writing and editing in the Canadian way. And it's a flexible but systematic approach to creating workable Canadian styles. And it's new and improved. Every chapter contains new material. Substantial updates were made to existing content. It includes expanded guidance on the editor's legal and ethical responsibilities, and the fact is, the big change really is that it's no longer just a book, it's also an online resource, which means that it is completely searchable, so you can quickly and easily find what you're looking for. It is also portable, so you have access to your subscription wherever you are, at work, at home, on the road, and apparently even on your phone. It is updated regularly, so because it's online, I guess that means it gets so much more mobile now. Yeah, so we won't have to wait 15 years for the next update, which is really quite good. So you can stay up to date with changes in Canadian English usage, which is probably good now that no Canadian dictionaries are being updated. So something to think about. You who does the spelling chapter. So what's inside? So there's 11 chapters, filled with information you need to make good editorial decisions on things like spelling, punctuation, measurements, and much more. Oh, sorry people, I skipped ahead. Why won't you go back? There we go. Okay, so I'll give you a very brief sneak peek of the 11 chapters. The first one is, oh, it's me, Canadianization. So we looked at I looked at when Canadianization is appropriate, the market, the editor's role, the rights and wrongs, in detail. Okay, so I'm to tell you, I'm reading the notes, I'm to tell you that I will speak in more detail about my chapter after the overview. It's a little odd to do somebody else's presentation. Krisha would have been far more professional than I am. So, and I did look at the rights and wrongs, copyright, permission, credits, and more, so we'll get to that. Chapter 2 is inclusivity. This was the avoiding bias chapter. It's now called inclusivity, which I think is quite modern. So they decided to choose a more positive title. It covers such principles as stereotypes, overgeneralizations, irrelevant references, condescension, unbalanced stuff. Balance. I'm thinking like crazy people. Juxtaposition and hypersensitivity.
We prefer reality challenge.
This is the Emily chapter. So that's where we look at principles to consider: ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, and plain language for lower literacy levels. The next chapter. There we go. The next chapter was spelling, with the infamous spelling charts that we were talking about over dinner. So it talks about Canadian spelling, choosing a spelling style, spelling in quoted material, dictionaries and other resources, and variant spellings. And Elizabeth will be speaking to this topic in more detail after the overview. The chapter 4 is compounds and hyphens. So compounds, the various types of compounds, hyphens, alternative to hyphens, and end-of-line hyphens. Chapter 5 is capitalization. So general specific issues, titles of persons and positions, institutions, government bodies, and official organizations, and place names in geographical terms. And I think that's where having a Canadian guide is really important. I've often found when you look to Chicago for capitalization, it doesn't quite have exactly what you need. Abbreviations, types of abbreviations, specific uses, plurals, and symbols. There you go. The 7th chapter is punctuation, covering all of the punctuation marks, oddly enough, and the digital world. I guess digital word for punctuation is what web concerns. I'm looking at you. You know everything web, according to me. So.
I know, I get labeled like a web girl. No, I don't know if I did a little bit about punctuation in my, in that chapter, and I don't know whether they forwarded it. I haven't honestly looked that early, or whether that was something that somebody else took.
It was probably somebody that somebody else did differently.
Yeah, that punctuation, but maybe talking about what?
Oh, it's going on its own. How did that happen? Okay. It doesn't do that at home for me, but I'm on a Mac.
Artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I walked away and it just decided to take over. So chapter 8 is about measurement, so metric versus imperial, and the sort of mix that we use of both in the Canadian usage, and the difference between metric and the international system of units, and converting units of measure as well. I also actually touched on that a little bit in the Canadianization chapter, because it's something you often do when you localize. Citation, so when to cite, what to cite, elements of citations, referencing systems, special types of citations, and reference management software. I'm guessing a lot of the new content came in the aspect of the reference management software. Let's go. So, and then chapter 10, legal and ethical responsibilities, the legal relationship between editor and client, libel, and copyright. And this chapter must have been updated a lot since 15 years ago, because a lot's changed with copyright.
Well, unfortunately, there's a brand new Copyright Act that came out since the book was published.
Yeah. But now that it's online, it will be updated sooner than it would have been otherwise. So, and this is obviously, this chapter is very specific for Canada, which is working with French in an English context, or within an English text. The accents, italics, quote marks, plurals, possessive, names of organizations and places, titles of works, word division, styles, syntax. That's a very sort of almost particularly Canadian thing, of this idea of having to integrate French text into an English text. Oh, did I miss something? No, it's 11 chapters. So, and then we're going to look at two chapters in more detail. Oh, so that's us now. Canadianization and spelling.
4 more chapters.
I know, but they come after, because they're the...
Ours is not really, we got relegated to
Yeah, you're not core
add-ons.
ECE. You're like ancillary.
Lord knows web is just this fancy new thing that gets stuck. No, I'm kidding. We had
So yeah,
discussions,
so
but
we do our bits now, and then they do, sorry to be doing this all, but it's, yeah. So I will briefly talk to you about Canadianization. When I looked at the original chapter, not much has necessarily changed. Localizing is localizing. It's a bit like copy editing. Copy editing is copy editing. Has it changed in 50 years? Some style things have changed, little things here and there, but essentially copy editing is copy editing. There was, what I found with the chapter in the second edition, it was really, really focused on educational books, textbooks. It was really focused on Canadianizing American textbooks. And there was very little of anything else. And oddly enough, they asked me to write the chapter, and I had no background in Canadianizing textbooks. I've Canadianized a lot of trade nonfiction and corporate materials. So I tried to bring that to the chapter, and I looked at it, and I kept all the textbook stuff, and then went for examples, and then sort of tried to make the material a bit more broad. I have also done a lot of North Americanization, where you're not looking to capture just the Canadian market, but you're taking a book from Europe or somewhere like Australia or New Zealand, and you're trying to make it work for a North American market. I did a stint of gardening books from New Zealand and adapting them for the mostly US market, but Canada as well. And you can imagine, in terms of climate, New Zealand versus Canada, this is very different. So I worked with a horticulturalist who went in and got all the right information, and we had the zone maps for North America, and we adapted all of the material. And we used US spelling, but we also had to take into account the various climates from Florida all the way to the Yukon. So that was a very interesting exercise in terms of localization and in terms of broad thinking, and that's the sort of kind of, I guess, aesthetic that I tried to bring to the chapter. I think it's a good chapter. I think if you have a good solid background in copy editing and are looking to find out more about what is involved with the localization and some of the basics of what you need to know, I think this chapter will give you what you need in order to do that kind of work. It's a bit specialized. It's probably not something, if you don't have a firm grasp of what copy editing is, you probably don't want to start launching yourself into localizing. But once you get the hang of copy editing and proofreading and know, what you're really doing as an editor, it's an interesting sort of skill to have in your back pocket. A lot of it is, and this was actually, I kept this line from the original. I thought it was great, and it wasn't so much a system as an approach, where you weren't going to do things really differently as a copy editing versus localizing. You just have to be aware of different things as a localizer, and that's what I tried to bring all of that knowledge to the chapter. So, and I will pass over to Elizabeth now, who will talk about spelling.
Canadian spelling. Now, I think it's a fascinating topic, but I have to say I was asked to speak with the students in an editing class that an American colleague was teaching. I spoke over Skype with a small group of American students who were voluntarily taking an editing class, and you'd think they would be excited about this kind of thing. And so I provided a little bit of biography for my friend, and when he introduced me to his editing students, he finished with the final item in my biography, the feather in my cap, that I had recently written, the new chapter on Canadian spelling in the 3rd edition of the reference book Editing Canadian English. And my friend then went on to say dryly, which of course I'm sure you'll all be running out and buying right away, and all of the editing students laughed. So possibly this led me to think that not everyone is quite as excited about Canadian spelling as I am. But I'll try to be as interesting as I can. I do want to say that like Nancy, I also participated in the chapter review process. I worked on a couple of chapters, including the spelling one, working with the great late lamented Karen Virag on that chapter. And interestingly, one aspect that most of us who reviewed the previous edition agreed on was that it was possibly time to let go of the long tables of all the different spellings in British, American, and Canadian dictionaries that were a large feature of the 2nd edition, and we put this in our recommendations. And when it came time for me to write the chapter, and the only direction I had different from our recommendations we'd originally made from the committee was, people love the tables. Do what you want, you're the writer, but just so you know, people love the tables. And I see heads nodding. So, the tables stay. You may all sigh. I will not be pelted off the stage. I did have some excellent help, was provided with really good feedback and suggestions from my colleague Cy Strom on the chapter, and also the excellent copy editor Sean Oakey, who copy edited the entire print edition, was forced by me to provide some content feedback as well, because I knew it would be excellent. And I also just have to acknowledge the wonderful Sarah Sweet, a Toronto editor, who just last week proofread all of those tables. She looked up every single word, it's about 200 of them, in 3 different dictionaries, and a handful of them in Caps and Spelling from Canadian Press, just to double check before it went into print, because I had a family emergency and couldn't do that final step myself, so I just thought I'd put that out there. So, Canadian spelling. I found this quote when I was researching for the chapter, and it tickled my fancy, so we used it as a bit of an epigraph. No one can accuse Canadians of being foolishly consistent in their spelling. As we all know, Americans spell one way, British spell another way, and Canadian spell sort of in between. A lot of people who are not editors have an idea. I was asked this just the other day when I mentioned why are you in Toronto? Oh, I'm going to talk about Canadian spelling. But you use British spelling when it's formal, right? And the answer is no. Neither of these traditions that feed into our Canadian spelling is more correct or more proper or even more formal. Both of them are perfectly legitimate traditions. Both go way back. Both honor with an OR and with an OUR were used in Middle English, for example. So it's not like American spelling is some Johnny-come-lately, hick, disreputable, second-rate spelling. So like the good Canadian compromisers that we are, we tend to use a mix of them. In some instances, the British uses are much more common. Czech with a QUE, color with an OUR, center and theater with an RE. But in many other categories, the American uses are much more common. And in some cases, the British ones are almost unheard of, although they do appear in Canadian dictionaries. But very few Canadians would write jail with a GAOL, for example, or aluminium with another I, and yet these are completely standard British forms. So one thing that, and in some cases, Canadians have made a distinction, right? Most of us now in Canada talk about a computer program with one M at the end, but a program of events is most often written in Canada with 2 M's and an E, whereas the American usage would be to use a single M both ways. So that's kind of an interesting way we've taken advantage of our dual heritage. But in an awful lot of other cases, Canadians are very flexible. We might have a preference, and you'll see one word more often than others, but most Canadians would not think twice about seeing pajama, PA or PY, gray with an E or an A, traveling, 2 L's, 1 L, percent as 2 words or a single word. We would recognize all of these perfectly well. We might, many Canadians who read a lot and think of themselves as very literate would be quite startled to learn how many words have 2 widely recognized spelling. They've simply never noticed that there are 2 ways to spell jewelry or pajama. So I find that quite interesting.
There are 3 ways to spell jewelry?
I only know of 2, but feel free to enlighten me.
There's your crazy way. With the J or the GAO.
So, one thing that most Canadians agree on, if you ask publishers or writers what kind of spelling they want to use, they will almost always say, I want Canadian spelling. If you ask them what Canadian spelling is, you'll get a different answer from every person. So this is the challenge of the Canadian Spelling Chapter of Editing Canadian English. What does it mean to spell like a Canadian? And this is the answer that we came up with. It is slightly updated from the last edition, but the general process for how Canadian editors for carefully edited manuscripts spell has stayed pretty much the same, which is, number 1, you choose a dictionary. Because we have so many words that are reasonably spelled either way, you've got to have some way of deciding which spelling, so you choose a dictionary. In Canada, this mostly means the Canadian Oxford Dictionary, 2nd edition. It's the only Canadian dictionary that exists that was updated later than 1998. It was most recently updated in 2004, so it's still 11 years old. It's not terrifically up to date. So not much has changed in it, but That's mostly the Canadian dictionary. It's pretty much won the market. No other Canadian dictionaries have been published since. However, if you're publishing something that will have a lot of American readers, or a lot of British readers, or in some cases, a global audience, often British English or American English is a better choice. So just because you're a Canadian editor doesn't mean you don't need to have dictionaries that are American and British. And many of us do own many, many dictionaries. And this is why I had this discussion with my husband, the woodworker, about I had all these dictionaries, why did I need so many? And I said, well, why do you have so many saws? Right? They all cut. But we use them in different ways for different purposes. So step 2, you look up your word in the dictionary and see if there are variant spellings, which there often are, 2 options, which one comes first. And we refer to this as editors as the preferred spelling in that dictionary. In Canadian Oxford, this simply means the one that's most common. Some dictionaries have a sort of editorial overview, lexicographical preference, and have emphasized one spelling over another for other reasons, but the Canadian Oxford approach has been to always list first the one that, when they did their research back in 1998, from a large database of Canadian writings, which one had the most uses. So, step 3, make an exception if you think you should. And the chapter discusses a couple of different reasons why you might want to make an exception from and use the second variant. It might be to maintain consistent patterns, because Canadian Oxford always goes with the most common one. Most of the time that means that similar words end up spelled similar ways, organized with a Z, realized with a Z, so on, but there are some quirks where it will turn out that, the one I can think of is actually a hyphenation one, cooperate and coordinate. Both appear on the same page within a few inches of each other in Canadian Oxford, one with a hyphen and one without. So if you're going to use both these words in your dictionary and you want it to look consistent, you probably want to choose to do them both the same way, even though Canadian Oxford doesn't. Other reasons you might make an exception, your particular audience. The example we put in the text is pediatric. In Canadian Oxford, is the preferential spelling is with just an E. It can be spelled with a diphthong, an AE, pediatric. But the Canadian Pediatric Society spells it with an AE. So if you were writing a book all about pediatric medicine, and many of your readers were going to be pediatric doctors who were members of the Canadian Pediatric Society, you might choose to spell it the way that they spelled it. So those are the kinds of decisions that Canadian editors make day in and day out, often without thinking about it, recording their little exceptions on the style sheet, and moving on. So, has everyone seen the tables? I brought a little sample. Because they're so famous, everybody loves the tables. These are the kinds of tables we have. I'm sorry, it's a sort of picture clip, so it's not the clearest. But so you know what the level of detail that we're getting at, and that my dear friend Sarah proofread. In the first edition of Editing Canadian English, British, there were no Canadian dictionaries. This is how Jurassic, the first edition, was. And it was thought to be useful to look up a number of words that could be spelled different ways and make some lists with different categories of how they were spelled in a representative British and a representative American dictionary. So there were 2 lists. By the time the second edition came out in 2000, there had been this explosion, and we had 3 Canadian dictionaries that all came out in 1998. And so instead of 2 lists, a table with 5 columns was made for all of these words, all 3 Canadian dictionaries, plus a British and an American. So in this edition, by popular demand, we created tables back to 3 columns, a representative US dictionary, a British one, and Canadian Oxford down the middle. So you can look up almost any word that has regional British and American variants and see. And as you can see, in the case of these ER, RE words, the patterns are very clear. On the American side, all the way down the left, we have ERs. On the British side, all down the right, we have REs. And on the Canadian side, we mostly prefer the REs, but you'll note this is another area where we do make some distinction. A meter, like a thing to read your electricity or your water, is usually spelled with an ER. whereas a meter, like about this far, is usually spelled with an RE. So it's a bit interesting. Do want to mention two more little things that I discovered while doing the research for this chapter. One was a wonderful paper that researched whether or not Canadian tendencies to use American versus British spelling had changed in history during periods where Canadian-American relations were less and more good. So I found this very interesting. And the answer was that they found that they had. During periods where Canadian-American relations were particularly strained, and they identified the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, sort of key periods of sort of low points, and did find an increasing tendency to use British spellings, small but noticeable. However, and this was the most interesting part, what these researchers found was that pretty much all of the weight of this preference was borne by the words color and center. As I said, most Canadians don't really notice how many words can be spelled variously, but they know about color, and darn it, if those Americans are being obnoxious, we're not going to spell it their way. So I found out that very, very just whereas all the 200 other words continued to be spelled in exactly the same proportions that they had been.
But it colored their way of spelling.
It did. They moved a little more left of center. The second one I thought I'd bring up, one of these American students I was speaking to had a question: what's the most controversial Canadian spelling issue? And I thought, well, I don't know about controversial. So I told him about color and center. But there is one issue that comes up in the chapter that could be considered a little bit controversial, so I throw it out there so that we can have a nice bloody discussion afterwards. And it came up in the second edition, and after some consideration, I decided it should be brought up, and actually the discussion expanded a little in the third. And that's the question of changing or not changing the spellings in quoted material. Right? Suppose you're publishing something in Canada and you have extracts from an American book that spells things in a different way than your style would spell them. Which way are you going to go? This turns out to be, some people have very strong feelings about this. The Chicago Manual of Style says categorically, and in an entry on Carol Fisher-Saller's blog on this topic, she says almost dismissively that of course you should never change the spellings in a piece of quoted material, because that would be egregious and awful. Interestingly, so I thought, well, I wonder if there are any Canadian style guides that weigh in on this matter. Now, there aren't very many Canadian style guides at all, hence Editing Canadian English, meant to be a companion to an American style guide so that you can use it for Canadian projects. Of the two uniquely Canadian style guides that are commonly in use, one of them, the Canadian Press Style Guide, said, of course you should make little changes to spelling in quoted material so that it matches your style. I see people are shaking their heads there, and many editors would think that. But many others would disagree, and like most things, it comes down to purpose, audience, who's going to be reading your material, what's the use of it. So both of these approaches are mentioned in the book, and including the Chicago Manual of Style's absolute ban on this practice. But as surveys, if you'll survey any group of editors, you will find that some editors in some publications are making such changes, usually with a notation that it's been done. And the truth is that the frequency with which this problem comes up and the kind of issue that it tends to bring up is very different in Canada from in the United States. So I don't have a recommendation on this issue, particularly one way or another, but I think that it's an interesting thing to talk about and think about, and as I said, there's a little bit of discussion in it in the chapter, and those of you nodding vigorously and shaking your heads vigorously, I encourage you to speak up afterwards and make your point and throw things and make all this a little exciting for the video. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now I kind of wish you had spoken first, because so much of localization is looking at spellings, and I was sitting there thinking, oh, I should have said that, and I should have said this. I find often because you talked about Canadian editors who have to work with US English, I've done that a lot because I work in trade books, and the Canadian market is very small. So when a publisher buys a book from overseas, they're usually adapting it for North America. And I end up using kind of a hybrid of mostly American spellings. I find it's the prefixes. Webster uses mostly closed compounds with pre and co, and I find some of them I just can't, like pre-mix as a closed compound, I just can't deal with. So I'll often keep hyphens in those. I'll often keep hyphens in those, and then when I go and I'll look at Canadian authors, I'll be like, okay, they hyphen, we'll throw that one in for the Canadians. So I find as a localizer, I'll use like a mostly US spelling, but still throw some elements of, I like sneak little Canadianization in when I do a North Americanization. So now I have to figure out how to get this out.
You can just close it.
Can I? This? Oh, perfect. Okay, now I have an arrow that works. Okay, so after mostly Elizabeth's wonderful presentation, Canadian localization is such a hard thing to try to do in 8 minutes, so that's why I didn't go into it too much. I used to teach a seminar on it on a half day, and even then I taught it with Greg Giano, and we felt we only scratched the surface. So if you want to find out more about Canadianization and localization, you can for the modest sum of $25 a year as an EAC member. That's the subscription fee for the online editing Canadian English. It's $35 a year for non-EAC members, but you should be an EAC member. And then, and both subscriptions are available for institutions, if you are in an institution. So where do you go to subscribe? Somebody's gonna catch that. So this is where you go to subscribe apparently, EditingCanadianEnglish.ca. That was handy that was available. That works out really nicely. And coming soon, available in June 2015 at the conference is where it's going to be launched, is the, oh there we go, I have notes here. The print edition will be launched at the conference. EAC will be selling it to the branches at a bulk price so they can sell it at their monthly meetings. Oh, exactly, you should know this. Monthly meetings, or it will be available through EAC in bookstores or online. So list price $44.95, and it's going to be launched at the conference. So now we're going to look at why subscribe to the online edition when you can buy the book. So you can have the most up-to-date information, so you can have access to ECE wherever you are, and if you are self-employed, it's a tax deduction. So the book would also be a tax. I thought the same thing when I went through her notes, but this is Krisha's presentation and this is her vision. So, but yeah, the book would also be a tax deduction. I guess this is a yearly tax deduction though, so. A lot of us, my account's always telling me to get more expenses because my overhead's too low. Because as an editor, we really don't have much in terms of overhead. So if you need some overhead, you can just create some overhead for yourself. It's good. Your accountant will be happy. And you can also try it free for 30 days. I'm supposed to ask anyone if anyone in the room has signed up for the free trial. So has anyone in the room signed up for the free trial? Okay, you have. Good. Okay, a few people. There you go. For those who haven't, I'm to invite you to do so and to give them a chance to explore the site, and I'm to thank the audience for being here tonight. There's still a bit more to go. And I'm really entertaining Sammy tonight. But that's not all. But wait, there's more. EAC is also publishing a companion volume to ECE3, chapters 12 and 13 of the online edition in 2015. Yeah, so there you're the companion. You're the companion. You're sort of like me, sort of like a consort or something. It includes editorial roles and requirements and specialized advice for editorial niches. The companions are available for the modest price of $10.
Yeah, we're cheap. It's true.
You could have a fun night out with the companions for $10. Editorial roles and requirements covers the professional editorial standards, which are also available online, professional development, fact-checking, indexing, email etiquette. That's a good thing. You can imagine what I'm like in emails. And then software for editing. The niches are online materials, production considerations, which I have to say, as a former production editor, that's a really good thing to know. If you work in print, I know a lot of people work strictly online now, but as a copy editor, especially as a proofreader, to know the stages and to know what happens and the impact of marking that change on a set of proofs and the sort of the fallout that can happen from making changes. It's a good thing to know and to be aware of print production considerations as an editor, especially if you're on that back end as a copy editor or proofreader. Editor-author relationships, editing processes for nonfiction books, and self-published authors. So this is another new section. It's a place you can go to learn about editorial niches that you might like to explore, like a conversation with an experienced editor. Oh, that's a lovely thought. Emily Dockrill Jones will speak to us a bit later about online materials, and Gillian Watts will speak about indexing. So these are the niches. There were none before. Oh no, there we go. So the niches, there's online materials, and then, oh, these are the niches, okay.
Yeah, and then there's more.
And then there's more, okay,
Yes.
sorry, I got confused in that. I'm sorry, people. So trade nonfiction, children's and young adult fiction, corporate and government communications, educational editing, and academic editing. And more niches, poetry, plays, and screenplays, cookbooks, magazines, science, technology, and medicine, and visual materials. And she made a note here. Interestingly, the team could not find anyone to write about editing newspapers. So the Times, perhaps. So you edit newspapers?
Yeah.
They are kind of a dying breed, though. I've heard a lot of newspapers have just had to cut costs, and one of the areas they've cut is their editing and proofreading staff.
They outsource. That explains so much more than it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
That explains so much more than it doesn't.
So we have, you're to meet the next two contributors, who are Gillian Watts, who will be talking about indexing, and Emily Dockrill Jones, who will be talking about online materials. So who would like to go first?
Well, I'm at the end of the process.
Okay.
That's true, it does make more sense.
Well, I
to have
actually
indexing
thought
last.
that that's the order they gave us, but I might have just been wrong. So I have a timer because I tend to.
I gave the order, so I.
As my dad says, I belong to the support group on and on and on. So I have a timer to keep myself at like 7 minutes, and then hopefully there's questions. So
Questions at the end, though, not right now.
No, yeah, sorry.
Okay.
But I just mean
Sorry,
that
I'm
then we
like,
can go
ah.
further for people. But it's interesting, it actually picks up a little bit on the spelling, because online I find a lot of, particularly around the hyphenation, hyphens really break up. People don't read the same way, so we prefer a lot of non-hyphenated words, so everything kind of gets jammed together, but at the same time, shorter words scan better, so you're kind of trying to do something, and you're always kind of going with the most popular, and consistency is less of a bugaboo on the web. Rightly or wrongly, I would say wrongly, but but that's it. So it's a real shift, and so I just kind of structured things to talk about the challenges around creating this chapter, and then some of what it entails. And the challenge was basically, A, it was a new chapter, so there was nothing to base it on. B, it's a relatively new area, but an ever increasingly important area. And one of the comments I had with Anne Louise around, oh, it's going to be a companion volume originally it was its own chapter, and then it became the editorial niches, like, subheading, which isn't wrong, but at the same time, I think it's its own beast in a lot of ways. So I can understand they were dealing with a lot of other considerations, and I don't want to be a pain in the butt. So I was like, whatever, it's fine. But yeah, it's interesting. And one of the other challenges was that really there are very few, but there are entire books on web style. And so how do you translate that into something? And it's one of those places that doesn't really have a Canadian style, because web style is its own thing. So dealing with all of that, and a then 2-3-month-old, as I sat down to write this, it just kind of became like, I just have to get this out. And so my first draft was like 3,000 words too long, after I'd already talked her into increasing the word count, because I was like, I can't do it in that few words. And so thankfully I had a lot of help from Anne Goodslewski, I can never say her last name, who is another KWG Twig member, used to work at RIM, really good with online stuff, and who came and sat with me in my kitchen because I couldn't leave the house because I had this child and it was winter and it was just awful. And so she came and sat, and we went through and looked, and then I have to give a shout out to Tammy Burns, who's here, who also looked at it and was able to sort of direct what might be editorial concerns. And part of my problem was that I'm often writing, but web doesn't often have strictly editors in some ways. So yeah, there were a lot of challenges around that. So what we had to do was kind of create an introduction that talked about the differences in web and print. And one of the big things is that web readers don't really read, they scan. So one of the big things with web editing is really content is important, and anyone in web will tell you, designers maybe not, but anyone in web content will tell you that content is king. It needs to be good content. But the editing process is a lot more visual online, and it's a lot more about how that content looks and how scannable it is. And then you have considerations like linking, and then you have considerations like the placement of links and the best words to use as links. You have search engine optimization considerations to get that content found. You have, text versus video versus audio, and the fact that you can do all of these things or just one of these things and how that works. You have bits of text like alternate text for screen readers and in case images don't show up. So there were all of these things to consider. And I had to go and remind myself what I wrote because I just didn't even remember. But trying to break it down and using the second edition of ECE, which is on my shelf, handy and well-worn, to sort of guide how to set up that new one. And so it's really hard. It's not an in-depth chapter per se in some ways, but it does sort of address those broader things. One of the assumptions I was able to make that helped clean out a lot was that it's for editors. So people edit, and in the sense it being a companion volume under editorial niches is helpful, because if I was going to write it as a style guide for the general public, it would have a lot more background and things in it. So there's an assumption that you sort of understand some basics of copy editing, that the words plain language mean something to you, those kinds of things. And so it was really just about taking those skills that editors have and helping them bring that online. But as an editor online, you are dealing with formatting issues. You are often pointing out links. So you have to know how content fits together. That becomes very similar, I think, to I've had discussions with indexers about how, optimization and linking overlap with the indexing task. So I think Gillian can maybe speak a little more to that. Well, she'll talk a little more about indexing, but that's one of those tasks, is figuring out how those pieces fit together. And so just bringing in how an editor then takes those print skills and moves it online. So you'll find stuff about search engine optimization, you'll find stuff about linking. To add even more complication was this whole social media thing and how to write. So it is called Editing Online Materials. It does focus mainly, and part of that is my own, I don't know if I'd call it a shortcoming, but just my own bias in that I tend to work a lot in corporate and organizational websites. So I do some e-learning, so there's a little bit of that, but that's a whole other ball of wax with a whole bunch of other considerations. So yeah, to bring it back to just sort of those standard informational web pages. Looking at how I'm doing on time here. Sorry, for some reason my phone is bucking. All right, I have a minute left. Go me. So yeah, so that was it. So you'll find stuff on links, on search engine optimization, a little bit about social media, and focusing a lot on scannability, because it really is a different way of people looking. So talking about how to shorten sentences and chop up paragraphs and sort of start breaking all those rules you learned in high school English that you just sort of feel like you're, it took me a long time. The singular they, if I had one web writing rule, it's like, go ahead and embrace the singular they. For the love of God, embrace the singular they.
Huge fan of the singular they.
I am, and I went from teaching in a justice studies program, which was very much, I was teaching communications, and it was a very strict communication. So you use, and learning about the proper uses of the semicolon. A semicolon has no place online. You start getting really free with the use of your dashes. Really free with the use of your dashes. For some reason, exclamation points pop up everywhere. I actually prefer to take those out, but some web writers are like, everything is awesome, it's amazing, exclamation point, exclamation point. So getting rid of that. But yeah, embracing the singular they, especially I was writing some medical stuff, and it was like, if your child is sick, take him or her, and it's like, just take them, and it's so much easier, and most people don't mind. See, there we go, you're over. See, I set it for 7 minutes though, because I knew if I set it for 8, I would still be going. But yeah, I think that's it. I'm really sorry. I didn't really prepare much, I have to say, but that was the challenge. And I guess I can say that hopefully it's a good reference. There are certainly other guides out there, but hopefully it's just a nice introduction and more often a touch point. So once someone has some skills in editing, but it's just, they've come back and they've got this web page and it's like, oh, what do I do about links, or what do I do about calling out to video content in this Word document that will eventually become a web page? This chapter now has some guidelines for you on that. So that is the Editing Online Materials chapter. Section of a chapter. I'm sure it will expand as time goes on, but I was grateful to be asked to write it, and I don't know how I got web girl, but I'm happy to share, so hopefully it is found useful, and all of the mistakes or anything you argue with is totally my fault, but I'm actually going to blame my son because I had baby brain when I was writing this, so keep your comments, you can direct your comments to Sullivan Jones. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, so yeah, hopefully that's a good new addition. It's in this companion volume, so if you subscribe online, it's included. If you get the print edition, it's an extra $10 for this companion edition, but I did my very best to make it worth the $5 because the other $5 is for Gillian's part. So it should be at least worth the $5, I think.
And I think a lot of editing Canadian English is more of a touchstone. I mean, it doesn't talk about the basics of copy editing and proofreading and all that kind of stuff. That's covered in meeting editorial standards. So it kind of makes sense. It's really meant for editors, so I think.
Yeah, I think with the web it's just a little bit different because editing isn't as strict a process online and stuff, so there were challenges, but anyway, yes, get the cane out, scoop me off.
Julian, you're up.
Well, speaking of niches, Heather Ebbs contacted me and said, can you do 1,000 words on indexing? So 1,000 words on everything I know about indexing in 1,000 words. But for editors, and this was interesting because I'm both an editor and an indexer, and so I had to think about how an editor would look at an index, because obviously editors are the people I do the indexes for when I'm doing them. I'm thinking, well, what do they do with them? So this is a little niche thing. It's part of Chapter 12, Editorial Rules and Requirements, and it's just a little thing. But what I tried to do is explain, let me give you another anecdote. I was just contacted by a designer colleague who said she had a book there and she's working with a newbie developmental editor, and the editor hadn't thought about the index until the last minute. And they were like ready to go to print next week or something like that. And is there some way they could do a quick index in InDesign? And anyway, we discussed it a bit, and I wasn't going to do anything about this. The designer had to do it. She went ahead and used this tool, and I warned her it would be a really bad index, but it would be something, and that's what she ended up with. So I thought, I realized then that not all editors are familiar with indexing and the indexing process. So I started off just explaining the point of an index, which I always describe it as a roadmap for the text. And it doesn't have to be a back of the book index, it could be a journal index or a web index. Basically summarizing the text and using series of keywords or concepts that the reader is likely to look for. And that's the important thing. Sometimes you have to interpret what the author has said. So you're acting as a kind of go-between between the reader and the text. So, and I also talk about how while anybody theoretically could create an index, it's probably better to leave it to the professionals. By the way, brought cards from the Indexing Society in case anybody wants to join or find indexers. The editor's role in the editor who's commissioned an index, the editor has to look at that completed index and check it for things like accuracy, spot checks of the page locators, that it's been alphabetized in the appropriate style, that the layout is in the appropriate style, whether it's run in or indented, depending on how much space is available, and what the publishing house uses. Spelling and syntactical errors, not like sometimes indexers slip up and put really bizarre syntax in. Reading level as appropriate, and one of the big things is the length, because sometimes pages available for the index will change, and the worst thing, there are two worst things that an editor can do. One of them is to say, let's set it in smaller type, and so you're looking at 6-point type, and they don't provide a magnifying glass with the book, so it's kind of a wasted effort. And the other thing is to start making cuts on their own. Now, an index is a very organic thing, so if you make a cut in one part of it, the odds are you're going to affect another part of it that you're not aware of, which is why I made a point of saying in this section, the indexer is the best person to carry out cuts and additions. So after getting all that off my chest, I just talked about the various types of indexes, structural and stylistic considerations. There are several varieties. How the sorting is done. There's letter by letter, word by word, et cetera, et cetera. The really bizarre Chicago letter by letter stuff. I actually have little pages with me because it's so small. The syntax, the language of the index. There are various approaches to it. You'll notice almost national styles when you look at the back of the book indexes from various countries. Especially the British tend to do very sort of elegant indexes, or sometimes even humorous ones. The examples I used were, this is what I call the elegant style, indexing eccentricities of. And then you have the conversational style, indexing a field beset with challenges. And some are terse, which is a lot more like me, indexing, history. So that's just, the indexer actually speaks a creative language. Indexing is a creative process, and that's why you can almost, if you're a real fan of indexes, you can almost spot who wrote the index to certain books. Then there's the issue of neutrality, which of course comes up in a lot of different editing things, that indexers should not and must not crank the index around to echo their own beliefs, especially if they don't happen to match those of the author. So neutrality is very tricky sometimes, especially with inflammatory material. Translations is another issue that is unique to Canada. Because we're a bilingual and multicultural country, sometimes you have works that are produced in two languages, usually French and English. It is preferable for the indexer to be a native speaker of the language used in the text. And if there's to be an index, a separate index for the language, say the indexer is English. The English-speaking indexer does the index for the English text. If there's also French text, you don't just translate the English index, not going to work. French is a completely different language, different way of approaching concepts. You need a French-speaking indexer to index that separately. So it's about the ways of conceptualizing information and expressing ideas that you cannot just translate. And sometimes you'll find that certain language groups don't suit indexing very well at all. If you look at especially books from France, they're not very fond of indexes at all. Character-based languages, such as Chinese, there is a Chinese indexing society, which is really cool. They're trying to figure out ways of making coherent indexes when you have a language that's got thousands of ideograms. Not exactly the same as alphabetizing 26 letters, so bless their hearts, they're working away at that. Another particularly Canadian concern is terminology. For example, for First Nations and other Indigenous groups, we have the old names, and then we have the names that are preferred nowadays by many First Nations, especially in BC. which are also spelling challenged, so you have to be really careful about that. I tend to go to the websites of the nation to figure out what their preferred spelling style and naming style is. And then there's issues such as terminology for provincial and territorial legislatures. They're totally inconsistent, and so are the people who sit in those legislatures in more ways than one. And then changing titles and unit names and classifications from military history. Not only have types of ranks changed, but they've also changed the names of the services several times. And especially when you're indexing individuals and they've risen up through the ranks, you have to take into account issues like that. And then there's the usual stuff like women's birth names versus their married names, titles versus the actual person's name, especially many governors general, Lord so-and-so, whose name was really such and such. And then there's the initialisms and acronyms and synonyms of all kinds. So there's a lot. I do speak a little bit about specialized terminology. This is when you're working in a book that may be for a general public but is written by specialists. You may need to be sort of translating terms sometimes for the general reader. Yeah, it's okay. It's a very short section. Okay. And then cross references. Everybody knows cross references. See also. Prince Philip, see Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, that kind of thing. Let's talk a little bit about software for indexing. Unless you're a serious indexer, you don't want to run out and buy it because it's expensive, but it's really good stuff. And anybody, if you ask an indexer to index in Word, they'll just burst into tears and say, perhaps I can give you some names of other people. So professional indexers usually use professional indexing software, and there's a reason for that, and get a good product. It takes away all the automated stuff so they can think about the real things like the concepts and the terminology. I also put a little thing about where to find more information about indexing. One of the classics is the Indexing Chapter in Chicago, which is very good. It's often recommended to authors who think they can index their own work. And the classic, straightforward Bible of Indexing, Indexing Books by Nancy Mulvaney. It's very accessible and has lots of good practical information. And there are training programs available too. This is a nice thing about it being online. The programs are always changing. The software will probably be changing. There are issues of indexing online material. It's something that's going through a lot of work right now. Where did I put that section? Embedded indexing, as it's called. They're working on standards for it very, very hard. But at the moment, it's kind of in flux. So that's another thing where it would be really useful that this information can be updated all the time. Although I do, of course, urge you to buy the companion volume. And
So you can get your $5?
So anyway, I'll put I see some of my fellow indexers here too. Put in a plug for the Indexing Society in case you are an editor who indexes and doesn't belong to it. I feel like a shill for the society. I'm always doing this. Anyway, thank you for having me.
So those were our companions. Thank you. Our companions of ECE.
Should have worn my net hose.
So ECE 3, because there's more to Canadian English than meets the A. So now we have time for questions. Apparently my watch is slow, but is it really 8:54? Is that right? Okay, so my watch is slow. Sorry, folks. We can. Oh, there's a clock back there. Dummy. Okay, we can have is it okay? We have 10 minutes for questions. Is that good? I'm looking at whoever's in charge. Okay, that's you in charge. Okay, so we'll go a little past time. Any questions at all? Whether it's about the chapters we wrote, even if it's not a chapter we wrote, if you have a question about a niche, there might be something. So I'll start with you. Yes.
So often we see it in terms of the triangle between Canadian British and American. But in any part of the construction of this document, you look at guides to Australian English, or for example, Indian English, English out of Africa, or any other forms of English, other nationalities.
I can say in terms of the spelling chapter and generally, we looked at the English what basically mostly informs Canadian practice. So in spelling, that's largely a British and an American hybrid, although like all languages, Canadian English steals from a lot of other languages. But there are, I think throughout the book where it's relevant, there are mentions, for example, of how you would spell Aboriginal names. There are the French and English context, the international system. So the focus is very much on Canadian English. It sometimes touches on more general things, but the focus throughout the book is, it assumes that if you want to find out about editing in general, or you want to find out about some other editing in some other country, you'll look elsewhere. But the focus here is on the things that are specific to Canadian editing.
Yeah, when I did my chapter, I mean, I'm aware of conventions of other countries because I've localized them. But I certainly didn't delve into, although I've worked with Australian English, I've taken Australian English and made it into either Canadian or North American English. So I didn't go into the conventions of Australian English, only what would pertain to transforming that into something that's more like Canadian English.
I think just because the web, and again, I work in Canada and I work mainly with Canadian or North American clients at least, but I think the web looks a little more globally, and so it takes into account some of those things around that. But again, it's really more than about translating something into a more, like, I kind of call it content design, because it's not just the writing of the language, but the standard there is global English, because especially if you have a global audience, it is global English because you are writing for people who might not be native English speakers, or then who have these variations. And the practice there is really to stay away from any kind of localized English, to make it that very, get rid of idioms and colloquialisms and slang of all sorts, and really make it sort of global English, which would be, the plainest form.
Yes, you had a question.
Yes, I'm not sure who, perhaps Elizabeth, referred to frequent updating, or more frequent updating than one could do with a hard copy edition. Is there any formal plan or structure in place for reviewing and updating chapters?
I don't know. Krisha probably would have known. What I can do is ask Anne Louise Mahoney, because Anne Louise Mahoney will know. So I'll make a note.
I know I already sent her a note about things I more just in I wasn't thinking of it as
I'll make a note. I don't have my pen on me, but it's in my purse. Because that is, as I was saying that, I thought the exact same thing. Oh, thank you, Anne. I wish I could tell them how often it was going to be updated and if there was a plan in place to look at it. I suspect at this point, just talking off my head, they probably have something in mind. It's whether or not they're going to have the resources to be able to do it. Because, I mean, as you know, it's...
So if everyone buys it,
Everyone buys it, but
there'll be
also
lots of resources to update it.
Because if we're counting on volunteers, and you need the right volunteers in place, it's not just anybody. We were very lucky to have people like Karen Bragg and Louise Mahoney to oversee this, because it's a lot of time, and this can't be done by editors without a lot of experience. I mean, these women had, they're in demand. There's a reason that they're able to do this kind of work. So to take, how often realistically, I don't know, but I will email her. If anybody has a question in the meantime.
For Emily, is there a little section you might have mentioned that's in your companion niche section on style guides that you would recommend?
I think, no, there aren't a lot of style guides. Sorry, I was saying there aren't. I think I do mention the one that sort of is the Bible of the North American web, at least, is the Yahoo style guide for web writing. But I think you'll know as you go through, they have a particular bent, like Yahoo has a particular way of doing things, and it is a way, but I think it's the most popular, but I think that's just for lack of a lot of competition. There was one, I have not seen a new edition, so it's quite old now, but there was what's EEI Press in the States, which what used to be the Editorial Eye, and then it just became EEI Press, had wired style. And it spoke a lot, and I still have a copy, and it was very good. I think it's changed a lot because, and I haven't seen it updated, it's probably 8 or 9 years old now.
Which is about 100 years on the
Which,
web.
exactly, yeah, it's too long. So yeah, so I think the Yahoo Style Guide's a good place to sort of go for that general, and then try to bring it up. There are lots of, I think more than style online, they talk about best practices. And a lot of them put it online because it seems weird for people in the web to then turn it into a print book. Like they don't, you know, and it's updatable and that kind of thing. But you will find some very good books on best practices. And there's actually a Canadian book, it's a self-pub by Self Counsel Press, but Crawford Killian out east, who's been working in the web since it was born. Like he is, and he is now, I think, working on the 5th edition, but the 4th edition of writing, it's just called Writing for the Web, can be a good touchstone as well.
So, another question? Tammy.
Question for you, Emily.
Of course.
I don't remember, I have a feeling it wasn't relevant when we were talking about the chapter, so I don't if there's any plans to add it or if it's already in there about the accessibility legislation for websites, because I know that Canadian, I don't know about it.
It is, yeah.
It's Ontario. Sorry.
Yeah, accessibility is a huge issue, but there's a ton of different, and so Ontario actually just updated their act to include online, and some places have and some places haven't, and then it can get around because if your website, like if you're not a company that's in Ontario, that even if Ontarians are looking at it, it doesn't apply to you. So I didn't touch, and it was one of those things that I kind of thought, should I bring it up? And I remember Anne Louise was just like, we have no more work. Like, as it is, of course, they had to make it a companion because it was like too long for the, it's fine on the web, but it was too long for the print edition. And that's a whole other book, and it's, right, like it's just so much. So it doesn't really touch on that. It does touch on styles around alt text and the best practices around providing alternate text. So it does address it in that sense, but no.
I had to work on that before. I was like, okay, I'm just going to just make them accessible. And I'm reading through the legislation, like, oh my God, I would just like something just kind of like break it down.
Interesting, because that connects with inclusivity.
Yeah, it does.
Check the inclusivity chapter.
Yeah, one of those really interesting things about the online materials is it does connect, like it connects with punctuation, there's spelling, you know, it connects with all of those other things. And so one of the things we've brought up is a way of actually working the online materials into each chapter as sort of a, like what to do in web context with these little things, and then having the separate section on sort of the broader stuff. And you know, of course, Anne Louise says, yeah, that's great, but it's a timing and resources issue. So certainly the way I did it is one way to do it, and you know, it's worth thinking, and I will volunteer you when they ask. I will simply say, hey, Tammy had a great idea, and you should follow up with her.
Any other questions?
You'd asked who had taken a 30-day trial. I was a little surprised you didn't ask if anybody had actually subscribed.
Oh, that wasn't in my notes. Has anybody actually subscribed?
Yay.
I myself, I will admit, have not done the 30-day trial because I've been working exclusively in US English since January, so I want to save my free trial for when I'm actually working in Canadian English. I've been localizing that series of dictionaries, and I have not touched Canadian English, so I figure I'll wait until I actually have a Canadian English project to work on.
I'll throw in, I'm an instructor for the copy editing program at Ryerson, the copy editing course in the publishing program, and we've been requiring Editing Canadian English as one of our textbooks in that course for many years, including when it wasn't available, supplying PDFs of chapters as necessary. We really think Canadian editors who are learning should read this book. So we will, of course, be requiring either a subscription or a book.
I teach the copy editing course at George Brown, the online version, and it's a recommended text. It's not, but it's a highly recommended text, and most of the students get it. And I was just
They can get the 30-day trial.
Yes, and so I was just talking to them, and that's actually what I said is, hey, there's a 30-day trial, but of course the course is a little longer than that, so they're like, when should I get it? So I think they're timing it out to like when exactly it's going to do them the most good. You know, these are where the tests and everything are clustered. But
Teaching an intensive version in June, it lasts exactly 30
yes,
days.
exactly.
Those students really luck out.
Yes, I think that's what we should do. But I definitely recommended it. I hope that they will go, and I have strongly recommended. I will subscribe when my trial is up. But
I will when I need it, because I mean I subscribe to CP Style online.
I also want the print,
online,
even
so.
though I have to buy my own section separately. I do also want the print though, because there's just I'm still for being web girl, I'm still a real bibliophile, and I like the old stuff.
So if we have time for one more question, who's going to be the lucky questioner? Oh, somebody must have a question. It covers every aspect of Canadian editing. Throw anything at us. Trade books, cookbooks, we can cover all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, we don't
here.
them.
I don't know how relevant this is. I was recently editing, it wasn't a Canadian thing though, but the author had written doppelganger with a lowercase d and an umlaut, and that made my head explode. And
That's the spelling.
That's the mixed style.
Right, so how very Canadian. Uncompromised. I like it.
So I guess that's it. If you have any questions about editing Canadian English, how it was put together, who worked on it, you can get in touch with me through any member of the exec. I think pretty much everybody, or at least you guys all have my email, and I don't mind being a go-between to help put you in touch with some of the higher levels. Really, we were all mostly just writers. I think you were involved in that high level chapter.
No, just like you, I was involved in a chapter review.
In a chapter, there we go.
And a couple of chapter reviews. But
Yeah, I just did my one. I mean, I know a lot about the Canadianization chapter and not as much about everything else.
I know Anne Louise Mahoney is the one who sort of
exactly,
still
yeah.
spearheading
So-
it, but I'm loath to. I think she would be the person, and I don't
Exactly.
think she's so lovely. I don't think she would have a problem answering
That's
questions.
the thing, I'm hoping
I know
you
she's
can
got so much going on that I'm really loath to say contact her because I just see her inbox exploding.
Yeah, which is why I'm saying contact me, and then we can put you in touch.
Maybe
with-
wait till the
with
print
people in the
edition
know.
is put to bed. And then,
Yes, definitely
and
go to the
fire
conference
away.
and pick up your print edition there. Oh,
I don't want to encourage anybody to cause Anne Louise's inbox to explode, but I believe she told me it's going to the printer today or
Like today or
soon,
tomorrow.
Yeah, because I had my
Yeah.
chapter to proofread and I had to go, I had full confidence in your team because I didn't have time to look at them. You were very good. I was just like, hey, if somebody else is proofreading it, I trust them. So it is going really soon, because it needs to be ready for June, so it needs to be, I mean, I doubt it can't be a 4-color book. It must be black and white, but it still needs to be time to print it and dry it and ship and all that. So, alrighty. Well, thank you all for coming out. I think at least some of us are going to be sticking around for a little bit. So if you
My
have,
bus doesn't leave till 11:30.
well, there you go. You have up
Here
until
all
11:30. You can follow her to the Greyhound station.
Yeah.
And then if you really want to follow her to Guelph,
Hey, yeah.
But yeah, just get a hold of us. Just accost us here while we're trying to have our tea in. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.